Hello, welcome to this first ever RWR Plays TEW 2020, and as you'll have seen from the thumbnail and from the title of this video, we're going to be booking WCW from 2001. We're going to go back in time to what was the end of WCW and taking the company on from there. For people who've never seen or heard of TEW before, it's a wrestling sim where effectively you get to book a promotion of your choice. The mod I'm using is a historical fantasy mod where basically WCW didn't go out of business and continues to run beyond the point where it went out of business in real life in 2001, and we're going to be taking it on from that point of view. In a minute as well, I'm going to go through there's an inbuilt sort of story to the history of the mod that explains where this kind of this timeline skews off of the real life story. So today we're going to just do an introductory video. So we're going to look at the roster, we're going to have a look at our schedule that we've got coming up, we're going to look at a few of the headlining things in the game. For those of you who have never played it or haven't seen it before, I'm not going to explain everything all the way through because that'll be dull for people who do know about TEW, but we may get into some areas and explain little bits and pieces here and there. But I think overall you'll just pick it up as this series, and I hope it is a series, progresses. So we're going to go into the game now. Okay, so here we are then. Good night and goodbye, question mark, question mark, question mark. This is the timeline that precedes this mod, if you like, the alternative timeline, and where the timeline skewed into this alternative reality that we're playing today. This has just been built into the mod, which is, I've not seen this before on other mods. Although I don't tend to play TEW 2020, I've got to be honest. I've been more of a TEW 2016 guy for a long time. I've never really got into TEW 2020, even though I did kind of get it quite early on. It just didn't catch on for me so much. But I felt, seeing as we were doing this series on YouTube, that I ought to get up on the newest or the latest version of the game, which is TEW 2020. So, in January 2001, Eric Bischoff, along with Fusient Media, purchased World Championship Wrestling from AOL Time Warner. The agreement will allow WCW to continue using wrestlers under the AOL Time Warner contracts for all WCW programming, but as of April 1st, 2001, WCW will no longer be given programming on TNT and TBS. So this is quite close to what happened in reality in some ways. There was a consortium called Fusient Media Ventures, the public face of which was Eric Bischoff, and there was an agreement in principle for them to purchase World Championship Wrestling from AOL Time Warner, subject to certain details being agreed, them dotting the T's and crossing the I's, or actually the other way around that should be. And that deal effectively ended when AOL Time Warner made the decision to take WCW programming off of TNT and TBS at the beginning of April. As Eric Bischoff has told the story since, effectively WCW wasn't really worth anything without the means of distributing Nitro and Thunder in its programming, so that it could then sell tickets, it could sell pay-per-views, it could sell merchandise. Without that distribution, it was pretty much worthless, and that's in the end what kind of completely destroyed the deal for Fusient Media to buy the company and led to Vince McMahon purchasing WCW. In this mod, what they're saying is effectively that sale went through despite AOL Time Warner's decision to remove WCW programming from TNT and TBS. Also in January, ECW held its last event, Guilty as Charged, before filing for bankruptcy. Many of the talent signed to ECW have become free agents, while WWF will be contacting former ECW talent. WCW and Fusient Media has already reached out to several stars. So again, this was, theoretically, effectively the same as what happened in real life. The only difference is that, in truth, ECW's last show was actually a couple of days after Guilty as Charged. It was a house show, but theoretically, Guilty as Charged was basically their last show that meant anything. And they did then file for bankruptcy later. And in the meantime, there had been rumours and kind of talk of pre-agreements being signed. I seem to think, or in my memory, Rob Van Dam is somebody that had signed one of these deals that was effectively reporting that he was going to come into WCW as soon as the Fusient Media deal had been finalised. So this was I guess Eric Bischoff and WCW searching around for new talent, seeing that there was this pool of talent now available as a consequence of the demise of ECW, and potentially trying to bring them in. And that will be something that we may have to do as part of this save. We're going to need to find young stars, young talent to come in and start to make WCW something for the future. Okay, so the timeline continues. In February 2001, World Championship Wrestling looked for a new home for television programming as Eric Bischoff is announced as the president of WCW and Brian Bedell will assume the role of CEO of the company. Brian Bedell, not really the name in the wrestling industry that he might have been had that sale gone through. So I think that he's quite an interesting character because he could have been quite a massive part of wrestling lore had this happened, but as it didn't, in the end he never really kind of became somebody that wrestling fans would ever care about. World Championship Wrestling is working through multiple television deals as they prepare for April when they are no longer part of TNT. There has been discussions with the USA Network, Fox Sports and ABC, but no deal has been solidified yet. Then in March 2001, WCW signs a new television deal but is not able to announce the partnership until their programming on TNT and TBS is over. Eric Bischoff does announce the launch date for the new WCW. The next pay-per-view, entitled The Big Bang, will air live from the MGM Grand Garden Arena on Sunday, May 6th, 2001. You can see here as well the poster for The Big Bang. Now this is actually legit. This was the poster for The Big Bang, WCW's return pay-per-view. That was the plan of Eric Bischoff once that deal had been completed. Of course, it never did become completed and The Big Bang never took place. April 2001, once the contract with Time Warner expires, WCW announces that Monday Nitro will be broadcast on the new channel, FX. At a press conference, Eric Bischoff and Brian Bedell announced that WCW headquarters will move from Atlanta to Las Vegas, where weekly Nitro will be broadcast from the joint at the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino. The reboot of new WCW will be the expected pay-per-view Big Bang on May 6th. So that's one decision we've got to make early in this game, is whether we're going to relaunch with the Big Bang pay-per-view or we're going to run an episode of Nitro prior to that taking place. I'll be making that decision at some point. The other thing that's quite interesting here, so the headquarters are moved from Atlanta to Las Vegas, and that actually does affect the game mechanics quite a lot. And I'll get into that in a little bit, but it does actually make quite a bit of a difference. So this I've just got to get through. So this is me picking my avatar. I'm going to select Eric Bischoff, as you might imagine. I'm just selecting his attributes for the game. I'm going to play as that character. I do not want to remove the characters from the game run. I want to retain them all. Sorry, that's just a little bit of nonsense I had to get through. So here you can see World Championship Wrestling, and these are all promotions I could potentially take over. So you've got All Japan Pro Wrestling, All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, AAA, Big Japan Pro Wrestling. You've got CZW, you've got ECWA, you've got, hell, ECW still in this. This is interesting. So ECW's in the game. Looks like this might be a rebooted ECW. So that's interesting. I'll have a look at that as the game goes through. FMW, you've got FWA in the UK, of course. You've got the German Wrestling Federation, interesting. You've got IWA Mid-South, you've got Michinoku Pro, New Japan Pro Wrestling, NWA UK Hammerlock, Premier Promotions, Noah, Toryumon, both Japan and Mexico. You've got WAW, another UK based promotion, WWC in Puerto Rico, WWF obviously, and then XPW, which was the MTV kind of created wrestling promotion. So that'll be another one to look out for. Here's obviously WWF. We're going to be World Championship Wrestling. Now I can either play as owner or as booker. I've made the decision to play as the booker. So the key difference there for people who don't know is that if you play as the owner, you is not that much different, but the difference is that as a booker you have someone above you and can be sacked if your performance isn't good enough, but also your owner will give you some goals to meet as part of being the booker, and again, if you don't meet them within the allotted timescales, that can be another reason why you get sacked. So effectively I'm going to be playing as the booker, Eric Bischoff, with Brian Bedell as my owner. And we'll go from there. So here we go into WCW. May 1st, 2001 is where the game starts. This is the main sort of main front screen of the game, you've got here news articles from the world, the universe that's built into the game. And then you can go into your office and you've got various bits of information along here. What we're going to start with, though, is looking at the roster for WCW. So we've got a whole heap of wrestlers all along here, and I've looked through this a little bit ahead of time just to get a feel for who's in the game. And I think you can broadly split this up into a number of different categories of guys. So first of all, the first group of people I want to kind of spotlight are the sort of the headlining guys that we are gonna be quite reliant on, certainly early on in this game. So Booker T, US title holder and world title holder. Interesting that in this different alternative timeline, it does appear, however, that the final Nitro that did take place and was booked largely by WWF took place exactly the same in this reality, and that's why Booker T holds both the US and the World Heavyweight titles. Whatever the case, Booker T is going to be really, really important for us. Somebody who's not massively overexposed by being in the main event of WCW for years and years and years, and therefore coming across as an old guy who needs to move aside, but also someone who's got the experience and the quality and the talent and the fan kind of the sort of aura with the fans that makes him a star. So we've got Booker T. I'd say DDP's in the same sort of category, even though he's slightly older and had been in the main event for a while in WCW by this point. He doesn't feel like he's of the same generation of Kevin Nash and Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair and Randy Savage and Roddy Piper and other guys that were old and had been sort of clogging up the main event scene for a very long time. So he's up there. Obviously Goldberg, massively important, and I don't ever think WCW fully took advantage of Goldberg's mega stardom. Even kind of in 1998 when he kind of hit the peak of his career, it just felt like they didn't really know how to book him, what to do with him, and I have some sympathy for that. I've been thinking a little bit ahead of what we're going to do with Goldberg, and it's not obvious to me how you book him really well and consistently well. Obviously you can make him really kind of unbeatable and like this wrecking machine, but that can only take you so far, and they'd already done that with Goldberg. What do you do when you get to the main event where Goldberg has to show a little bit of vulnerability in order to continue to be a top star, and how do you sell believable heels who can compete with him when he gets to that level? So that's something we're going to have to figure out as part of the game. We've also got, I would say, Scott Steiner as somebody in this position. So again, though he'd been around a long time, didn't feel overexposed as a main event talent at this point. I think Steiner and Booker T, in terms of their careers in WCW, feel quite parallel to one another in that they've both been in kind of long-term tag teams that were really good tag teams for a long time and always seemed to have the potential to be main event guys, but for whatever reason it had taken them so long to get to the top, and when they finally did get there, WCW closed. And so I feel like both of them are going to be really, really important to us going forward. We've also got Sting, who is on the sort of barrier between being one of the old guard, I would say, and being still able to go, and that feels strange given that 23 years on, Sting is only just now properly retiring. But at the time, Sting kind of did feel a little bit lumped in with some of those older guys, and I think that's fine so long as he's perhaps the only one who really is used at that level. So I think Sting is going to be really important. I think the other thing with Sting is, and there's a similar thing we've got with Ric Flair that I'll talk about in a second, or at least I'll talk about Ric Flair in a second, is that whilst keeping them around kind of binds that mentality that WCW is the place for the old guys, getting rid of them would actually be a major problem for our kind of legacy WCW fans who love Sting and love Ric Flair. Sting, though, is 42 years old and could still be sold, I think, as a major star. Flair is 52 years old, so 10 years older, and by this point in his career, not even as didn't even have the aura that he eventually would have in WWE. Like, he'd really reached a sort of low end of where his career was, and I think we've got to make a decision about how we treat Ric Flair. I think the way I'm seeing it is we kind of have to manage him out slowly from the company so as not to annoy the WCW hardcore loyal fans, but also so that we can start to pivot away from that kind of branding almost that WCW was this old person's promotion, and that kind of brings me to that second group of people. So Flair is one of them. I'd say that Lex Luger, the total package, is another. Kevin Nash, who's also on here somewhere. They are all part of the group that really maintain WCW's kind of feeling as this old guys promotion, and in some cases is not very fair. Like Kevin Nash is only 41 years of age. He'd only been a main event guy really for sort of 6 years by the point that WCW went under. It felt like, you know, he shouldn't have been lumped in with that, but there was just a certain amount of laziness I think people looked at from his perspective during the last few years of WCW that sort of put him in that category. We've also got people like Jim Duggan, for example, who are just way too old to really, and I say way too old to be valuable. It's not that they can't be valuable, it's just that WCW at this point really has to start to eschew that kind of reputation, and I think he's just not helping matters at all. Road Warrior Animals, another one. Arguably, possibly you could argue that Rick Steiner is in that situation as well. Certainly feels like he's past his best. We've got Sid Vicious on the roster, although he's currently out injured with a broken leg that he suffered at Sin earlier in the year, and I don't know how long that's going to be before he can come back. So that's kind of another group of wrestlers. There's probably one or two others that I've missed. Then we've got what I would call either WCW mainstays, all of which that I don't really know what to do with, or at least there's nothing immediately coming to mind that I can do something with them. So I'm talking guys like Alex Wright, I'm talking about Chavo Guerrero Jr., I'm talking about Disco Inferno, I'm talking about Billy Kidman possibly, although I guess he's a decent cruiserweight at least, but he's another guy that's synonymous with the company. Hugh Morris is another one that I just, you know, I've always struggled to think what I would do with them if I was booking them. They don't feel like they've got a really good niche that they can fit into, but they all are synonymous with WCW. Conan is another one I would say that's sort of in that category. Norman Smiley possibly. One or two others probably in there. I can't find them immediately, but effectively these are all guys that have been around WCW for a long time and at least kind of keep that thread from the original company going through into this new ownership period, but I just don't know how to use them. I feel like they need to stick around to keep that kind of legacy handover almost between the two different companies and the eras that we're talking about, but I just don't have a great idea of what to do with them. We've got not a very large amount of wrestlers in the upper mid card or mid card that I think have the potential to move up a level. The only ones I could really think of are Mike Awesome. I think he's probably he's got the most potential in that situation, and Lance Storm. Both are experienced enough and have enough quality in terms of their skills to potentially move up to that next level, and they're not overexposed too much on television, so it feels like they both could be, they could both be guys that we rely on to move up the roster and become potential main eventers in the future. I'm not sure though whether Lance Storm's really in that place. Like, I just don't know if he's ever going to be a top main event guy, but Mike Awesome does feel like someone who could do that. We also have got Jeff Jarrett, who I know had been a main event guy in WCW at this point, and I'm not a big fan of, but he does have a rare sort of combination of the fact that he's not too old, but he is experienced and he is quite talented, which there aren't a huge amount of people on the roster that are in that space, so he could be relatively valuable just from that perspective. Another person who's a bit like that is Shane Douglas, I'd say. Again, quite experienced, not too old, not too overexposed in mainstream North American pro wrestling, but he'd probably never be a main event guy, but could help us at least in the early going. And Vampiro, I guess, potentially. I think there's questions over him in terms of his attitude and whether or not he really he can do it at that higher level. I think what's key, if we're going to make him into anything, is to keep him away from Sting, because WCW seemed to just want to keep going back to Vampiro versus Sting all the time, and it just got a little bit tiresome from what I can remember. Then there's one other key area of roster talent here, which are the sort of very green, not experienced at all, and brought in quite late in WCW's run, that therefore aren't overexposed but also aren't necessarily any good. So for example, we've got Chuck Palumbo, 2 years of experience. You've got Elix Skipper. You've got I'm just looking through now, can't find them typically. Where are they all? Mark Jindrak, for example, Mike Sanders, Reno, Sean O'Hare. I think we're going to have to assess each of them individually as we go through the game. There are one or two others as well. I'm going to have to assess how good they are, whether in the game they're actually better or worse than they are in reality, because that's the other sort of X factor here, is that the game itself has its own idea of how good these guys are, so it doesn't always exactly line up with exactly how my opinion of how good they are is. But certainly Sean O'Hare is somebody that was always seen as having a load of potential, so potentially we can use him, but it's going to take us time. It's going to take some time to get these guys into a good place. And as I said, they're quite green, so not all of them are going to make it. So we'll sort of judge them as we go through. And then there is the Cruiserweight division. So obviously we've already sort of mentioned Billy Kidman, but also Rey Mysterio Jr. is in here. He could be very important, but obviously note no mask. So obviously he'd lost his mask in WCW 2 years prior to this point. WWE, when he came in about 18 months later, they conveniently just was like, well, let's just put the mask back on. And that was obviously a genius move, because he's very, very marketable with the mask. We're going to have to make a decision about if we're able to get the mask back on him. First of all, can we do that? Like, is there a way to do it that feels legitimate? And also, whether or not we can do something then once he's got the mask on to really push him into a heavyweight position, because again, when you consider Rey Mysterio's career, in reality he's had a main event level career, but when he was at the end of his WCW run, that just didn't feel very likely, especially as he was quite small. He was a bit smaller when he was in WCW. When he came to WWE, he put on quite a bit of muscle mass. So then that's pretty much the main group, and then we've got a couple of interesting characters here. So AJ Styles, obviously, a very, very big deal this could be for us, but it's going to take us time. The game is quite good at making sure that you can't just get someone like AJ Styles and put him in the main event. It judges the quality of their matches and their angles, not just by their skills, which are also something that build up over time, but also by their popularity. And as you can see, his popularity is very low in the US because he's just not very well known. So that's AJ Styles. You've got Chris Harris and you've got James Storm, America's Most Wanted, in WCW's roster at this time. Jamie Noble in the Cruiserweight division as well. And that's the other issue, is a lot of these guys are cruiserweights. We're going to have to figure out a way to transition one or two of them away from that, especially AJ Styles. But over the long run, there's quite a long way for him to go in that respect. So that's kind of an overview of the roster. Lots of different things that we're going to have to think about. Lots of things we're going to have to decide and figure out whether we want them to be a big part of WCW going forward. One thing I did want to point out was a bit of a quandary I'm in between who should be the lead announcer. So first of all, we've got Mike Tenay, and we've got Tony Schiavone is the other one that I would say is sort of an option here. Now, Tony Schiavone was the lead announcer for WCW for the most part in terms of the run on Nitro from 95 to 2001. And I think a lot of modern fans now who've watched AEW will think I'm crazy not to go straight to Tony Schiavone, because he's certainly redeemed his reputation with his work in AEW, I would suggest, to a certain extent. The problem is at the end of WCW in 2001, Tony Schiavone was not motivated anymore. He had completely lost all motivation. He was phoning it in most of the time, and he just wasn't at it anymore. And he was a bit overexposed as well. He'd been WCW's lead commentator for 7-8 years, and he just felt a tired presence on the show. And I don't think necessarily, again, obviously the game won't factor in as much, although it may do in some ways. But I am trying to be realistic and trying to kind of imagine this is happening as at the time. Whereas Mike Tenay felt like the obvious go-to guy at the time. Like he'd been waiting in the wings for quite a while, for Tony Schiavone to move aside and him to come in and be the lead commentator, and obviously he then would do that in TNA for a long time. I'm minded to go with Mike Tenay at this point, but you might think Tony Schiavone is a better option. Let me know in the comments who you think is the right man to be our lead commentator. Scott Hudson's also on the roster, but I can't see many people advocating for him. But who knows? Maybe there's someone out there. Maybe Scott Hudson's biggest fan is out there somewhere. So let me know if you are that person. And then just in terms of color commentators, so we've got Stevie Ray, and he's about it in the promotion at the moment. So that's an area we're going to have to address. So that is the roster. Here's the titles. We've got the Cruiserweight title holder Shane Helms. I didn't mention him in the roster roundup, and he could be quite important. He had a successful career in WWE later on and was showing real signs of potential at this early stage in his career and his early time in WCW. So he's the current Cruiserweight champion. We've got the Cruiserweight Tag Team title, which is a belt that I've chosen to... I went into the mod and edited this because the mod made it inactive as a title, but we're bringing it back. I like the WCW Cruiserweight Tag Team title, and I want to keep it. So Billy Kidman and Rey Mysterio Jr. are currently the tag team champions in the Cruiserweight division. We've already mentioned Booker T is the US Heavyweight Champion, and he's also the World Heavyweight Champion. And then we've got the World Tag Team Champions, which are Chuck Palumbo and Sean O'Haire. They were, quite two newcomers, really. They'd both only been in the company for just over a year by this point. So they were elevated to the top of the tag division quite quickly. We've got to determine whether or not they are going to be good enough to hold on to that belt for any length of time, or whether we need to transition that to someone else pretty quickly. Just have a look at the tag teams. We've got 3 count. I'm quite a fan of tag teams in general, so even if I'm not a big fan of the individual wrestlers, the tag teams will probably stick around for a bit. Evan Courageous and Shannon Moore here. Air Raid, which is Air Paris and AJ Styles. Edith Skipper and Kid Romeo. A lot of these were put together to be part of the Cruiserweight Tag Team division. Harlem Heat, who aren't really together anymore, obviously, because Stevie Ray's a color commentator and has basically retired. Jindrak and Stasiak. Young Dragons, Kidman and Rey Mysterio Jr. Chronic, cannot stand either of these two guys. Not particularly talented, but again, they've got a tag team. They're established, and I'm minded to keep them for the moment. Luger and Sting, that's not a tag team we're going to keep. We're gonna make them inactive because Sting is a babyface, Luger is a heel. Sean O'Haire and Chuck Palumbo, obviously the tag team champions. Steiner Brothers, Team Canada, which is Lance Storm and Mike Awesome. Got a decision to make about Team Canada, about whether we keep that going. I've always found that a little bit strange, especially as Mike Awesome, I don't believe, is Canadian. The Insiders, DDP and Kevin Nash, and Mamalukes, Big Vito and Johnny the Bull, and then Totally Buff, which is Buff Bagwell, and the Total Package. There's also a stable that we've got at the moment, which are the Filthy Animals, first of all, Conan, Kidman, Rey Mysterio and Tigress, but also we've got the Magnificent Seven, and this is probably the key one for me because these guys formed together in January of 2001, and they were basically running the show for the last sort of 3 months of the company existing, and they had Scott Steiner as the champion, and they'd basically taken everyone out. They'd taken out Booker T, they'd taken out Sting, they'd taken out Goldberg, they'd taken out Sid, and it was like nobody could stop them. And I'm not a fan of just resetting all the stories like they did, for example, in WCW in April of 2000, the year before, when Eric Bischoff and Vince Russo came in and took over. They basically reset all the stories, reset all the titles and everything. I'm not a fan of that at all because it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't ring true in any kind of universe that you're trying to create. What about all the people that were following the stories and the characters that existed prior to the end of, before that reset? It's really not a good way of dealing with things. So one thing I have to deal with now, as a consequence of my kind of attitude towards a reset, is that the Magnificent Seven exist. They're still in place. They're still in play, and I've got to figure out a way how to use them. Whether I want to use them, and if I don't want to use them, how I'm going to kind of transition away from these guys being the Magnificent Seven. And one last thing I want to show you, events and TV. So we've got WCW Nitro every Monday on FX. So that's obviously one of the key elements of this, is that the idea is that Bischoff and Fusient Media found a television deal for WCW Nitro on FX, and it will run every Monday. So we're still going to be in a Monday Night War with WWE as well, which I'm not loving. I think if they were smart about this, they would have found a way to maybe transition the whole company to Thunder and then run it on a different date to both Raw and SmackDown, because I just think at this point in time it is going to be so difficult for Nitro to compete with Raw on a Monday night. The star power alone in Raw, in WWE at the time, is such that WCW are going to really struggle to compete in any way. And there's the Big Bang. We're not going to do Slamboree, which is also in the game already, because that would mean we had 2 pay-per-views in 2 weeks, and that's just nowhere. That's way too many for the company and the star power that we've got in the company at the moment. And then we've got all the other WCW shows, although I've never heard of Bad Obsession. I think this might be one that is just a randomly generated name for some reason. I don't think that existed in real life, so we'll get rid of that. And we may change some of the schedule here. I don't like how inconsistent it is in terms of which week in each month it is. You know, I like a 4-week schedule of pay-per-views, to be honest, but that might not be possible in the early game, but we'll do what we can. And you see what WCW Saturday Night and Thunder both off air at the moment. I don't imagine I'll be adding those. I think we'll just stick to Nitro, because I think Nitro 2 hours a week is a nice way to go. So that's the introduction episode. As I said, there's a few decisions to make, whether or not we start with a Nitro or go straight to the Big Bang. We've also got the decision of who to make our lead announcer. Is it going to be Mike Tenay? Is it going to be Tony Schiavone? Is it going to be Scott Hudson? You never know. People might think that. And we're going to have to start looking at the market, see who else is out there. I think on the front page here it says that there are kind of something like over 1,200 guys in the game. Actually, it's not showing me now, but you know, there is a lot of different workers in the game, and they are all here, and I'm not going to scroll through them all, but as you can see, there are loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of workers in the game that we can look at. So we got to take a look at who's out there, who we want to bring in, and who we can bring in. And yeah, we got to start looking to do what we do in the first show, and what the big stories are and what the big matches are going to be. So I'm looking forward to bringing you all that in the next episode. But for now, thank you very much for joining me.